Good day, everyone. It's the best content creator you've never heard of, Waifu Belector. And I've got a bit of a think piece here for us today, and I'll be honest, I'm mostly making this because I keep getting triggered by a certain phrase that keeps getting thrown around haphazardly. And that phrase is, one of the best games ever made. People throw that line out a lot about all manner of popular games, but to be a bit more particular with what I'm talking about is when it's said about old games. Well, how old is old? You know? I guess I'm sort of talking about like a minimum of 15 years, shit like that. That's what automatically raises an eyebrow for me. Games that are unquestionably, astoundingly out of date. And so my goal for this video is to highlight the validity or lack thereof when it comes to this mindset that what you think are some of the greatest games ever made are from 15 and 25 years ago. So let's get right into it. Now, to start things off, let me say this. There's nothing inherently or automatically incorrect about an old game being called one of the best. If it holds up and is still great, then that's just what it is. But having said that, the odds are stacked against you. When it comes to both creative and non-creative endeavors, people progress. We gain new understandings and do new and better things, or iterate on the old until it's at its most refined. So just based on time and natural progression alone, the value of like 95% of all creative things will be largely diminished when they're 15 and 20 years old. There was a time where Space Invaders, primitive as it may seem now, was an impressive little must-play of a game. But what happened? It got old. Not just in age, but with the passing of time, we'd seen more and learned more and had begun to expect more. And while we still respect and appreciate Space Invaders for what it did, it doesn't quite cut the mustard today, or hell, even 20 years ago, because 20 years ago, it was a little over 20 years old, and games had come a long way since then. Now, there's certainly a value that comes with being the first to do something. And that value sort of allows you to fight back against those who would say you can't compete in the modern era. However, while being the first should often grant you almost permanent respect and a spot in the metaphorical Hall of Fame, being first doesn't mean you were the best. On the game rating scale, yes, you get a good amount of ticks on the innovation meter, but when someone else comes along and says, hey, that's a good idea, but what if we did it like this? And then their way becomes the new de facto way to do your idea. Not only have they innovatively iterated on your idea, but they've completely trumped you. Now, whenever people do the thing the way you originally presented, they can't believe anyone ever used to do it like that. And then people like to go, well, you guys wouldn't even have their thing if it wasn't for me. And yeah, we respect you for it. But their thing is better, and your thing is now obsolete. Is your thing still the best? Should we still say this is the greatest ever? How? We've made it better, and we don't do it the way you present it anymore. In fact, the way you originally presented it is now bad. Like, for example, someone a bit older might say, the original Metal Gear Solid is one of the best games ever made, because it ushered in a level of cinematic flair that had never been seen before that point. And in the modern era, cinematic presentation is all over just about everything. So Metal Gear's fingerprints are all over the place. This is very true. But what did I say? First is not best. Try to be unbiased for a second. Think about all the games that are heavily cinematic right now and tell me if you honestly think 1998's Metal Gear Solid is better. Probably not, because Father Time doesn't just affect us, it affects our games too. What was once top shelf and cutting edge 24 years later is a game with wonky controls, bad camera, and ugly, muddy graphics. What? Those graphics were amazing back then. Yes, back then, not anymore. And it's okay. But if we put our nostalgia and biases to the side and just honestly compare some things, a lot of best game ever picks are a bit outrageous these days. And I'll admit, It's a complicated equation trying to calculate how much weight a game's influence should hold with how well it holds up with its place at the time of release versus a modern game's place at the time of release. It all seems very difficult, and it kinda is. So let's get a little into that. Like, let's take something that everyone liked from a long time ago. I don't know, let's say Banjo-Kazooie. And let's take something that pretty much no one likes from recent times. Let's say Marvel's Avengers. Now, if you could release those games in the same era at the same time, just as they are, most people would almost certainly say that Marvel's Avengers is better, because it has all the benefits that come with 20 years of progress that Banjo just doesn't. But in reality, is Marvel's Avengers better than Banjo-Kazooie? No! Why not? Well, here's my reasoning. Here's how I break down the first part of the equation. Every creative product, first and foremost, you are always pitted against your peers. You have to be above a certain threshold among your peers in your era before you are allowed to enter the wider video game arena. So yes, technically, in the most literal sense, a lot of sucky new games are better than a lot of good old games, but this is when it's appropriate for a game to be weighed against its peers and the sensibilities of their era specifically. Because Marvel's Avengers lost in the first round. You can't compete in the finals. You lost already. Like, you know, like you didn't beat the first people you went up against. How can you now say, I want to battle those guys? Like, no, you lost. And all this applies because there is no going back in time, only forward. So if you suck for your own era, then you suck forever, because you can't go back to a suckier time and try to compete with them. But if you're good in your era, that's still not enough, because now, if you want to hold that status, you have to keep up as time progresses, and you're only as good as well as you're keeping up, because there is only forward. It's not fair, but it's life. So it's for that reason that I feel like old games shouldn't get this little caveat of, oh, but it was really good at the time. No, bitch, that's over. Be good now. I used to be considered good is enough to defeat sucky newer games, because those games weren't ever considered good. You know, so your once good status trumps never good status. But when going up against modern good games, I used to be good isn't enough. You have to be good now, and you have to be better if you want that crown. If the only people who call a game the best game ever are people who remember a time when this was actually impressive and fanatics that those people brainwashed with nostalgic rhetoric, then that game is not the best game ever. I don't think anyone really thinks that the original Resident Evil 2 is one of the best games ever made, but I'll still use it as an example, because I'm sure there are people who swore up and down about how great the original Resident Evil 2 was right now in the modern era. They swore that it holds up, and yet the remake has effectively replaced it across the board and in the public consciousness with nary a peep out of anyone. Why? Because it's better. A lot better, because the remake has the benefit of 20 years of modernization. But if the original were actually still so great right now, how could it have such a drastic amount of room for improvement? The answer is that the original Resident Evil 2 actually is not a great game 20 something years later. Maybe it's perfectly fine. I'm not saying you can't have any fun with it or enjoy it, but is it still the amazing, flabbergasting game you thought it was in 1998? No, I doubt it. Now, I do want to talk about a game that a lot of people regard as one of the best RPGs ever made, if nothing else. And that game is Final Fantasy XII. You thought I was gonna say 7. You were ready to fire up that keyboard. Anyway, yeah, I played Final Fantasy XII at the beginning of this year, the Zodiac Age version, so it does have those quality of life touches, but at its core, it's the same game. I'd always been aware of 12, and I played it a little when I was younger, but this year was the first time I really sat down with it and played it all the way through. And I was actually really impressed with how it held up overall, because while it definitely doesn't feel like a modern game almost at all in most places, it still comes closer than a lot of games from its era. And when I think about other games from 2006 and around that time, I can totally see how someone at the time played this and came to the conclusion that this was the best game ever. But to carry that feeling with you for 15 years, largely ignoring everything else, seems insane to me. And listen, I think Final Fantasy XII is a solid game still. Right now in 2022, 2023, it's worth a play. But one of the best? Seems like a stretch at this point, you know? The game was made in 2006 and it still mostly feels like it. Also, to reinforce another point I made earlier, let's look at Demon's Souls. The Demon's Souls remake specifically. I played it pretty recently. Yes, it's a remake, so it looks like a modern game and plays smoother, but this is very much the DNA of that game from 2009. Demon's Souls was the first of the modern Souls formula. Does that mean it's the best? No, we've learned that, didn't we? The only other FromSoft game I've played is Elden Ring, and I played it before Demon's Souls. And yes, I know Bluepoint did the remake, but it's basically the same game as the original. But anyway, while playing Demon's Souls after Elden Ring, I could feel the 13 years of experience in Elden Ring disappearing as I played Demon's Souls. Even with the new coat of paint, old games don't just shoot up to the top. Granted, Demon's Souls remake would likely be even worse if it wasn't as gorgeous as it is, but that alone isn't enough to save it. It's just not a very good game. It's okay at best, but it's outdated with some bad mechanics and level design that pales in comparison to what we know can be done with the FromSoft formula now. The Demon's Souls remake was loyal to a fault. It stuck too close to its roots and as a result is just a middling game at best, albeit one that is absolutely stunning to look at. But as time passed and we gained knowledge, this loyal remake of a 2009 game isn't up to snuff anymore outside of its visuals. So overall, what's my point? What the fuck am I trying to say? Well, I'm not really trying to lead you to any definitive conclusions. My point is that I think people should more carefully consider games from a more realistic view before just going and spouting off best game ever, best this ever, best that ever. I mean, I ultimately feel this way with like movies and TV shows and like all creative media, but you know, let's just focus on games for now. Just because something's an immensely popular game and or one that is very nostalgic or personally meaningful to you, you know, that doesn't mean that it's the best game ever. And I hope you can actually, separate that when you go out and actually try to critique these games and, try to compile your little list. Like guys, I have the same wonderful childhood memories of Smash Bros. Melee as a shit ton of other people. Oh boy, it warms my little heart. But listen, Smash Ultimate is better. Like it just is. So I just hope next time you're compiling a little list of painfully generic games to call the best ever, you actually remember this video and more carefully consider the truth. And hey, you may find out that the game you're so damn nostalgic for, even when you put that nostalgia to the side and fairly evaluate it, that game truly is one of the best, who knows? At the end of the day, this is all subjective, so it really doesn't matter if you're like, well, nostalgia plays a factor, nostalgia matters. Like, okay, cool, it's fine, it doesn't matter. There's no actual true blue definitive answer here. All of this is subjective. This is just what I think, about the criteria and stuff like that. So anyway, that's all for me for now, I guess. Like the video if you like the video. Subscribe here for more of this nonsense. And if you like spicy 2D waifus, then follow me on Instagram. I'm at WaifuBelector. But until next time, I have been WaifuBelector. I am just a normal guy. I like hentai, and I'm gonna go play a remake of an old game. Goodbye.